Thanks, Matthew. Great to be here this afternoon. It's quite funny, the last few public speaking engagements I've had, I've very much been the pessimistic person in the room. I've been the one who's kind of wheeled on at the end to bring everybody back down to earth, usually related to the independence referendum, I have to say. But it's been great this afternoon that I feel really encouraged by much of what I've heard today. And I think the original brief, Matthew, was we should use this session to try, as campaigning organisations who's been involved in organising the conference, start to look at areas in which we might work together moving forward, which I think is really important. I was thinking, during a couple of presentations today, our last meeting we had with the First Minister back in May, very long sort of pre-referendum chat on what areas we could work together with on sort of post the referendum, whether it be yes or no. We decided to concentrate in three areas. The first one is what we call the foundational economy. This is a concept developed by the Centre for Social and Cultural Change at Manchester University. What's it about? Well, it's about recognising economic development policy right across the UK really hasn't delivered for people and communities for about 30 years now. And the key sector-led approach, which is not unimportant and has its place, is never really going to deliver on a community basis, on a geographic basis. So it's about looking at what they describe as the mundane sectors of the economy, the goods and services upon which we all rely, we all use day and daily wherever we live. How can the social franchises that often underpin production and those services be used to deliver more for local communities? Really fascinating, something we're just beginning to scratch the surface of, I think, at Scottish level. The second was inequality, I don't really have to get into that. And the third was, a key priority of the Scottish Government's reindustrialisation. This is often one of the subjects in which I'm the pessimistic person in the room. I think it's important, I think we should do what we can, but I think what we might ultimately achieve in terms of job creation, I think is likely to be limited. But through all the discussions today, heard an awful lot, I think, and of course, those three areas I've just spoken about are all interrelated, and I think much of what we've heard about today is really important in progressing those agendas. Structural regulatory reform of banking and finance, I think the major structural barrier in developing an economic development structure in Scotland that works for all our citizens, I think, is the role of financing the economy. So I think it's great that there's such a consensus round about that. Tax, public ownership, these are all areas that I think we share a lot of common ground. But I think the area in which we might really be able to find really strong common agendas is around about inequality. I think one of the main the really quite remarkable shifts that's taken place in the last 3 years is the huge intellectual shift, I think, in terms of the various important international domestic institutions that hitherto would never have engaged in a discussion about inequality, now recognising it as one of the main barriers that face progress at all levels. And I think further to that, whereas before the crisis and even for a time after it, the debate about inequality was very much framed about global economic trends. It was about skill-based technological change. It was about trade. I think people are now beginning to accept that it's much more about norms and institutions, which are far better at explaining the differences between countries and the differences within countries that we've seen in terms of inequality trends over the last 30 years. So what are the kind of areas I think we should be looking to work together on moving forwards if we're going to all accept that inequality is one of our very major challenges? Well, I think we'll get back to what we said about the foundational economy. The first area would be developing a more effective economic development strategy. It's difficult, it's long term. I think the outcomes are uncertain, but I think we have to get back to look at economic development as something that's there to serve the needs of all the citizens in the country, rather than those few workers who work in a few supposedly dynamic high-tech sectors. I think the second is collective bargaining. I think it was mentioned by Anne this morning, but inequality ultimately reflects asymmetries of economic power, and I think nowhere is this more revealed than in changes in union density and collective bargaining over the last 30 years. And I think when you look at where those changes have been more pronounced, that is where inequality has grown. I think changing it, I think we shouldn't pretend that we can pull a couple of levers and we can immediately change union density and collective bargaining back to the way it was, and its height in the late 70s. But I think government at least has to start recognising it's a problem. Government has to recognise that they were part of the problem in changing that. It wasn't all down to structural economic changes, and we have to work together to see what we can do in terms of ensuring that many more workers in the economy have the protection of a collective agreement. I think the third would be tax. I think the independence referendum has been really hopeless in this area. I think it's been tremendously unhelpful in ingraining, orthodoxies around about tax. Nobody really wants to discuss it. The only actual mechanism we hear about is cutting corporation taxes. And we hear a lot of quite silly stuff comparing Scotland to the Nordic nations. Well, frankly, the Nordic nations collect each year between 8 and 13% more as a proportion of GDP in tax than Scotland does. And frankly, we will not develop economies such as they have unless we are looking at that tax. So we have to be thinking about tax in terms of total tax take. And interestingly, as I'm always pointing out to people, their tax systems are actually regressive. Everybody pays more. Consumption taxes are a much higher proportion of the total tax take. And I think the second point is around about top tax rates. Now, we've tended to see this as primarily about distribution. If we tax the rich more, that is a bigger pot of money there to redistribute. Now that's not unimportant, but it's also about incentives for those at the top to rent seek. We've heard a lot about rent seeking today. Well, the incentives have changed massively over the last 30 years. And what you've seen is as top tax take has come down in countries. Pre-tax income has been up because the incentives have changed for executives to extract more for themselves. I think, I'll quickly run through the rest, but ownership and control, covered beautifully by Andy later on, has distributional consequences. Corporate governance, we very rarely talk about that. It's seen as being boring, kind of mundane stuff. Really, really important, in terms of, holding executives to account, and putting limits on what they're able to extract. Macroeconomic policy, we've heard quantitative easing being discussed. The distributional consequences of a couple of speakers have already mentioned are huge. We very rarely hear about that. And of course, we're talking about a version of independence in Scotland that would leave those levers at UK level. Finance, I'll come back to it again, but you look at what has actually changed in the UK. The top 1% receive about 10% more in total income than they did in 1979, but 60% of all those gains that went to those working in the financial sector. It's not a caricature to start arguing that the lords of the universe in finance have been able to extract so much money for themselves. We have to start talking about that more at Scottish level. Privatisation and outsourcing, huge impact there as well. I just want to finish by saying a few words about economics. We've heard a lot about that today, and I want to kind of mix it up a wee bit. I'm a wee bit sick of going to events, particularly through the referendum, where people are just playing to the echo chamber. So I will take on the role, probably put myself in a minority of one of being, a partial advocate for mainstream economics here. I think it's important that we recognise there are good and bad aspects to mainstream economics. We might blame it for forcing austerity on as well. It's also true that the most effective critics of austerity are what you might describe as mainstream economists. I think we need to recognise where mainstream economics has been particularly bad, and I think the nexus between financial specialists in economics and the financial sector has been a particular concern. But again, we shouldn't use that as a brush to tar all economists with. And what kind of worries me is, we criticise the mainstream, and by implication we kind of accept that the heterodox is good. Well, there's kind of good and bad heterodox as well, and we've heard a lot of good heterodox economists today. But, as I said in the breakout session this morning, criticising the mainstream open the door to the heterodox. You open the door to, a variety of charlatans, cranks and fraudsters, and frankly we've heard an awful lot of them, particularly through the independence referendum debate. I think the bigger issue, and I think Sheila began to touch on it, in Scotland is the lack of capacity in economic issues. I think in the academy itself we don't have enough economists concerned with the Scottish economy. The media has almost no economic capacity at all. The only economics correspondent we have is someone who's very at the BBC, very interesting job title of business and economy editor. Why is the economy a subset of business? I can't get my head around that, never could. And I think we have to look, we have to understand that we've not got the media there and academia to facilitate a much deeper debate about the Scottish economy, and I think we're always going to be struggling. Where I think I do see signs of progress is, I mentioned the Scottish Government there. The office for the Chief Economist at the Scottish Government, I guess, is populated by mainstream classical trained economists, very, very open-minded people, very open-minded. I've already described the areas that you'll be working with them on. The kind of speakers they've had up to their events that hold with the Scottish Economic Society. I know the New Economics Foundation up, they're looking to get the Crest people up from Manchester. Very open-minded. We've seen a bit of work recently between the David Hume Institute and Friends of the Earth, and that's really quite remarkable. We would never, reckoned on that happening a few years ago. Really interesting stuff around about the future of banking. So I think we can be a wee bit too pessimistic and a wee bit narrow about how we look at economics, and I think there are elements of the mainstream that we can certainly work with, but probably spoke too long. I'll leave it there.